Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this online version of the talk that was originally destined for Performance Day Spring Edition. The topic of today's talk is Silk 2.0, Spider Silk and Beyond. And what I would like to look at this talk, on the one hand, is a little bit into what silk is, where it's coming from, and what its applications, not just in fashion, but particularly in sportswear are. But maybe more importantly, what its innovation potential is, why that is the case, and what we can see in the space of innovation going on at this very moment. But before jumping into the middle of things, a short little bit of background about myself. My name is Pamela Ravasio, Pamela in short. I'm managing director of Shirahime, and Shirahime is a consultancy in the sustainability space where we focus on governance and board practice on the one hand, offer services as Chief Interim Sustainability Officer, and we do cherish our very strong links to innovation processes and digitalization across the different consumer goods industries with a focus on textiles and performance goods industries. And we're based in Switzerland. Without further ado, let's jump in the main topic, silk. So silk, as you might know, has a broad range of applications. And you see a fair part of them here on the screen. On the left-hand side in yellow, you see the part that certainly in textiles we're most commonly used to. And the application is, unsurprisingly, clothing, but also furniture, often in the luxury space, but not only. And then there are also industrial applications. And those that have been to the military or have been involved with the military would know parachutes, of course, but also certain bicycle tires or gunpowder bags often are made out of silk. There's also a performance application that goes beyond just sportswear, as we will see. In particular, the attributes of silk, if it's tightly woven, prevent, for instance, insect stings. So this is where sometimes it's used in protective textiles. This all said, there's also completely, certainly in textiles at least, nearly unknown aspect to silk, and that's the biomaterial application, most commonly found in either medicine or cosmetics, where silk in its polymer and chemical component is applied, so be it, for instance, in surgical sutures, but also as carrier, for instance, for drugs of active ingredients, sometimes in order to replace non-petroleum applications. And that's one of the areas in particular where also a lot of innovation is going on. There has been claims in the past that clothing made of silk is suitable for people suffering from eczema. However, scientific research isn't entirely conclusive about that. There may be, but there may not. It's about a 50-50 chance. It's a similar insight, more or less, as you might know potentially from certain areas of research around wool and wool clothing applied to eczema patients. So there, really, the call is still out. In performance wear and sportswear, we most commonly know silk for base layer applications, be it the silk sleeping bag to carry around to go from hot to hot, or as an inlay in your normal sleeping bag, as a mixture into, say, wool or gloves, often combined with wool. And the reason is actually quite simple. It's not only a very nice hand, so quite smooth on the skin, but it's also a great thermal insulator as a fiber. And the two things taken together obviously make it a good high performance fiber in applications where friction isn't necessarily a big issue, or at least where friction is diminished by being straight tight on the skin. If we're looking at silk in the bigger schemes of things, in particular in what its role is globally in the world fiber production, to really see that it's quite important to look at the bigger picture first. So you see that roughly around 29% of the world fiber production is natural fibers. That's roughly the equivalent of about 60 billion US dollars worldwide. If we're starting to zoom in, however, in what that means in millions of tons and the role that silk plays, it's certainly getting quite a different picture. And you see that from the natural fiber production in 2018 of a total of about 32 million tons yearly, silk really just makes a fairly small percentage. It's about 0.2 or 0.3% of the world fiber production, and the small slice, you see it here illustrated where the red arrows go. Another way how to look at fiber types and silk in that context is, and certainly textiles, is the type of fibers that we find, where they're coming from, but also how they're being processed. And if we look at the huge variety of fibers that we know, both man-made and natural, man-made cellulosics, man-made natural in quotation marks fibers, but also purely petroleum-based synthetic fibers, the selection is really quite broad. The silk fibers fall into the broader family of protein-based fibers that you see here at the bottom left in that red signed area. It falls over the broader family as well as, for instance, wool and similar fibers fall. However, if we start to break that down even further, there are considerable differences. For instance, hair, fur and fleece, which we know from, say, alpaca or wool, is a keratin fiber and is a grown fiber. In contrast, silk fiber can take various origins, be it from fibrine, so typically the silkworm, hence insects, spiderine, coming from spiders, or byssus, which is a collagen-based moss or sea silk variety. All of those are spun, if you wish, on demand. So the little animal, the insect or the spider or the mussel, really just produces that fiber if and when it is needed for its purpose in nature. That obviously is a very interesting attribute, that something is spun on demand on the one hand, but also that it isn't a staple fiber, but a filament fiber naturally coming into being. So the question is, given all those different fiber types, insect silks that we typically know, and which, if anything, most of the fashion and performance applications are made of, the spider silk, which has been in the news most recently, because there's one particular variety, that of the golden orb spider, that has allowed with a lot of effort to create an absolutely beautiful garment exhibited at some point at the V&A in London, but also the byssus or sea silk. They all have slightly different attributes as a fiber. It is quite interesting to compare those, and the question then obviously arises, which of those can or should we look into as we go into innovation aspects? You see here in comparison the differences between insect silk, spider silk and sea silk. And while we know still very, very little of sea silk, maybe with the exception that it does have self-healing properties in certain environments, we know a lot more about spider silk, about its technical properties, and this is why it is one of the focus areas where people see it as a bit of a gold standard when it comes to performance and innovation. It is also important to understand that silk qualities, and it really doesn't matter whether we're talking insect silk or any other type of silk, comes in a variation of qualities. They are typically graded from a 1C through to a 6A, where 6A is the best possible quality that you can possibly achieve. The higher the grade, the more white, luster and long the strands of the fiber are that come off the cocoon early in the processing stage. And the lower the grade, the more colored, if you wish, but also shorter, thicker and irregular those fibers are. For the luxury sector and applications in high-grade textiles, such as we also know in textiles and performance textiles, 6A and 5A are the typically used qualities, but it's only about 10% of the global silk supply that can achieve that 6A, 5A grading. Which means that while lower gradings in some cases still are used, say for instance, for neckties or fashion scarf or certain, say, more design-oriented fabrics, the waste percentage that comes out of the cocoon breeding and of silk that hardly is used at all in high-end applications, even though chemically it's entirely the same type of fiber, is really quite huge. We can assume, without having actual tangible figures anywhere available, that possibly over 50% of the global cocoon production isn't used in textiles at all. If lucky, they might get used in maybe some local textile production that never sees the public eye of anything else but local communities. But most likely they might actually just be discarded and go back into this cycle of well, nature running its course and therefore biodegradation. Silk has at least insect silk. Spider and mussel is slightly different, but once you understand the silk supply chain, you will also have a much easier time to understand the other two varieties. Silk has a very distinct supply chain, which has kind of a Y shape. So on the one hand, on the left-hand side, you have the part where the silk worm and the silk moth come into being. So the silk moth laying the eggs, which then eventually hatch, become silk worms. They make their cocoons, from where the silk moths hatch again, and so we go back to do the cycles. But most silk these days isn't actually grown in the wild. Therefore, where this right-hand side of that Y comes into being, where mulberries are planted in plantations so as to collect the leaf so they then can feed them with the silk worms. There exists wild silk, and certainly in the cottage industry, that's the way silk is still being produced. But 90% and more of the world production of silk is from China and India, and it's by no means a cottage industry. It certainly is a very industrialized approach of both growing the silk through the cultivation of silkworms, but also the cultivation of the mulberry and the mulberry leaves needed to feed the silkworms. Once that the silkworms have spun their cocoons, there are a few that are left to hatch so as to have the eggs for the next cycle. However, the vast majority of them will then go into the reeling process, where in essence it's a process where the cocoons are cooked and then the degummed. So there's a gum that holds the fiber tight to form that cocoon. So these fibers are degummed, and then the silk is reeled. So the individual strands are rolled off what used to be the cocoon and put onto spindles and similar type of equipment so as to be one filament coming off. And then there's a twisting, dyeing, and so on process that comes from there. And please take note of the two blue rectangles that you see here on the screen, because we will have a further look into those when it comes to looking at what LCA data gives us in terms of silk impact. But I can already sort of spoil the beans by saying these are the two areas where the biggest impact will be seen. And the mulberry plantations, in terms of ecologic impacts due to the use of fertilizers, but also pesticides to a certain extent. And then in the reeling process, due to the cooking and the degumming and similar process that are quite energy intensive. Talking of LCA Insights, many of you will know the Material Sustainability Index published by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, and which is publicly available. And what you see here is a screenshot of the silk fabric rating available on the MSI. Now, as I said before, the vast majority of silk globally available, certainly in textiles, comes from China and India, with both together way over 90% of the global raw silk supply. But also China is much a bigger player in this area than India. So we can really safely say that China drives the market at this point. This has also an implication on what you see here in terms of silk LCA, where you see that the raw material source has by far the largest impact in terms of LCA rating. The reason is that the mulberry growing needs fertilizers, sometimes pesticides. The silkworm breeding creates nitrogen from the silkworm's poos, if you wish. The cocoon cooking is water and energy intensive, as is the degumming and reeling, which also to a certain extent needs cleaning chemicals. Now, knowing that China is, for instance, predominantly coal energy driven, there are a number of aspects why the rating of silk in that early production space is so high, and where that silk material origin source impact is quite devastating compared to, say, other fabrics such as, say, cotton, lyocell, or wool. Now, the important piece here to point out is this is based on industrial processes, and it does by no means apply to what would be the cottage industry processes. There are supply chains that do perform significantly better than the rating that you see here. And if you do not have a traditional mainstream silk supply chain you are working with, but you know that your cocoons come from a different geography or from a breeding facility that has not sort of run-of-the-mill type of energy sources, but say, for instance, uses renewable energy and similar, and has a very efficient process in terms of the cocoon cooking and the degumming, it is worth looking at that in closer aspects and maybe actually do your own LCA rather than to rely what is available in public sources. The differences can be really quite staggering. If we're rethinking with that knowledge of LCAs, of impact, of the different types of fiber that exist, and re-looking at the silk types that we've seen before, the insect silk, the spider silk, and the sea silk, and start to think about which of those attributes is it actually that would make an ideal silk really desirable if you want having the cake and eating it. Because each of those silk types does have its own pros and its own cons. For instance, insect silk is, as of today, reasonably affordable, and it is quite widely available on the world market. In contrast, spider silk is a lot stronger, a lot tougher, is quite a bit more elastic. And then to contrast both of that, sea silk does have a natural way of self-healing, which again, none of the others do. So once we look at that, an ideal silk characteristics look something like that. Strong as spider silk, tough like spider silk, or elastic like spider silk. And an equally consistent and scaled out production of silk as we know it from insect silk, but without the waste. So to the specification of the quality that is needed for a very specific application. It would be self-healing. It would have standardized and industrialized processing in place, and it would be circularity fit. So there would be no waste produced. It would be recyclable, and existing waste can be used as input to this industrial process yet again. And to complement that with the two attributes for which silk is known already today, it would obviously maintain its attributes for thermal insulation and for biodegradability in its pure form, at least. Now, here you see the summary of what I've been talking about in terms of natural silk, where we have silkworms, spider, mussel, some of it going into industrial processes, some of it going into cottage industry, and by far most of it is textile only applications. That is what I will call silk 1.0, if we look at it from a scientific/engineering approach. Now, that is quite a limited view, and here comes then the complementary view into place, where I would say this is silk 2.0, where engineering and innovation really plays the key role. It would be man-made silk, so something akin to what we know today of man-made cellulosic fibers. And as it is today already, we are in the know of two approaches to that. One is a genetically modified engineered approach, and one is a bio-based approach. The GM approach is quite interesting because there are a couple of those efforts around, but one in particular that I'm aware of uses yeast. So that's the one from Ball Threads. They use a yeast strand that they have genetically modified. And basically that yeast, instead of creating what you generally would know as from, say, baking or from beer, it creates silk protein. So it creates the chemical component of which silk can be created. And with that, it is possible to define scientifically the level of quality, toughness, strength, and so on of that silk fiber that then is created out of that silk protein from that yeast. An alternative approach to that is a bio-based approach, and that bio-based approach by and large starts off where also the natural traditional silk starts off, namely with the silk cocoon. Rather than, however, having to select by grade of a cocoon whether or not it's top quality or whether it's usable, the silk of any type of cocoon is usable because the technology and the chemistry behind the bio-based approach takes the silk apart into its basic component and then puts it back together as needed, yet again for the specific application. Some of those applications can be in textiles, in a broad textile context. It could be in healthcare, again, in particular as an alternative to a petrochemical carrier for drugs that are being injected. Or it can be used in cosmetics, again, for its protein attributes, or as a sort of carrier for other kind of substances that go into cosmetics. And then there is, of course, the textile-only application, which also potentially could be looked at, but is, I would say, part of the wider innovation space. So In some cases, the textile only application is just a result of a further refinement process in terms of engineering from the silk protein. So between one and the other, the man-made silk approach gives us a complementary approach that has the opportunity really to make much better use of the silk resources that are globally available, but also to reduce the waste and to target the application of the silk and the silk proteins used to where it has most benefit. For instance, in order also to replace petrochemical applications in certain areas as we know them today, which are particular healthcare and cosmetics. Over the next few slides, I would like to introduce one of those innovative approaches of Silk 2.0 coming out of the bio-based engineering approach. It's a company that is called Spintex Engineering. It's quite a young company, a couple or so of years old. It's based in the UK. And their thinking really is to tackle various challenges that the traditional silk supply chain offers at once. They look at trying to produce silk fiber to specification, hence reduce waste in the course of that because they can use just about any cocoon. And also they try to use the use of energy by offering a process that works at room temperature and therefore does not need heating and up of a lot of water in order to cook or to degum the cocoons as we know it from a traditional silk supply chains. So the Spintex engineering process takes silk cocoons as its point of departure material input, and it doesn't put any quality restrictions of those silk cocoons as long as it is pure silk. The silk cocoons are then fed into a chemical process that turns the silk cocoon into liquid silk protein. So it is an active silk solution at room temperature and therefore really quite energy savvy if we want. And it goes on then to go through a process that is a pultrusion process where through the pulling of those protein fibers out of that active silk solution, the fibers are formed through the pull stress and the water that is still contained in that silk solution is drained out. So the water is expelled and what that forms is a solid fiber. And the beauty of this process is that you can say by adjusting the way the pultrusion happens, whether you need a 6A, spider silk, or just a reasonably low grade 3A silk quality. By using all of the input cocoons, there's no waste. So in the end, the input versus output ratio, and therefore the waste is nearly non-existent, whereas input equals about output ratio, and is just a question of what the quality is that you're getting. Oops, the other way around. So the output is a premium grade silk fiber to specification. That is the important part, really, to specification. There are a number of currently ongoing efforts, but if we look in this particular case here, to compare Spintex with a traditional approach slightly improved, we do see that there are significant benefits if Spintex is able to scale out their approach. There is a better strength that they can design for. They can design for better toughness. They can design to elasticity if needed. It doesn't have a self-healing property, but neither does today's silk either. It uses a much lower energy and low water amounts, and then there's basically no waste because it's produced to specification, as opposed to even an improved process of current traditional silk process. It will have a bit of marginal change, and yes, there might be ways to improve that, but it won't make a significant change. It might be a change within a few percentage points, but not one that would allow to use all the resource material. Current traditional silk is somewhat recyclable. There is some limited recycling going on, but by and large, there's not a lot of recycling really happening worldwide. It's mostly virgin fiber in use, whereas a Spintex approach could very well also use pure silk as input from, say, 100% silk garment, and is able to separate out the chemicals that come with it. On the flip side, Spintex is a startup. It's just graduating from the lab to first scale out into a slightly larger production facility. So going from a few hundred grams to a few hundred or a few thousand kilos. And it therefore, for the foreseeable future, quite an expensive thing to do. And whereas any improved process on traditional silk will have an impact on price, but it's by and large just a marginal change. I mentioned other approaches before, and here is a complete comparison of those that at this point probably have the most innovative technology on the market. It's Bold Threads, that is a GM-based, Spintex is a bio-based but textile-targeted approach, Cocoon Biotech, which is a bio-based but more generically applicable engineering approach, and then of course the traditional, as we had it slightly improved potentially. And we see that all of those engineering approaches actually do target very specifically at the challenges that the current silk industry does offer in energy use, in waste, and so on and so forth. But it's also equally clear that startups and early scale out companies are by no means anywhere close to produce the quantities that, as of today, the world market needs for silk. Even if it's just 0.3% of the world fiber supply, this is still a significant tonnage that at this point, none of the available companies, even combined, can create. So for the foreseeable future, traditional silk isn't going to go away, but there is no doubt that with what's coming down the engineering pipeline, there will be, rather sooner than later, viable and very interesting engineering approaches available. And I would really encourage everyone to look in details at these three companies here in particular, but also to have an eye on what is happening in this area. Silk is and remains an extremely versatile and widely applicable fiber. There are new areas coming into the game as we speak, in particular in the medical application, where before derivatives of certain petrochemical chemicals were used as drug carriers and a lot of other applications. And with silk, actually, we would have a way to decarbonize those applications that are, in most cases, still absolutely essential for the industries that are used in, be it healthcare or otherwise. With that said, this is it for today. In the currently published version of Ecotextiles News, you have the link at the bottom. It's freely available for a change. There is a short summary of what you've just read with a couple of more pictures. And I would strongly encourage you also to look at that edition of Ecotextile News. It's really got some quite interesting articles in. I would like to say thank you for your time, for the opportunity to listen to these talks from performance days, despite or precisely thanks to the currently ongoing situation. And I'm looking forward to hopefully meet you in person and see you in the autumn at the next in-person edition of Performance Days, possibly in October, maybe it's November 2020, but certainly in person and not over distance. Take care, all of you. Stay safe. Stay home. Bye.